everybody, and welcome to Leading Interviews. I'm Carol Schwartz, the founding chair of the Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by two incredibly talented women who are working in the Australian screen industry. Deanne Weir is a former media lawyer turned producer and screen investor, a board member of Screen Australia for 8 years. Deanne was instrumental in the development of its Gender Matters program and remains a member of its Gender Matters Task Force. Deanne is also chair of the Sydney Film Festival and For Film's Sake, an advocacy organisation providing opportunity for all women in production, distribution and cultural exhibition. And Tosca Looby, a TV and documentary filmmaker with Sydney-based Northern Pictures. She is the producer of the wonderful series Love on the Spectrum and See What You Made Me Do with Jess Hill. She is also the producer and director of A Strong Female Lead, a fantastic new film about former PM Julia Gillard's time in office, which premieres later this year. Hi, Tosca and Deanne, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Well, firstly, Tosca, congratulations on the film. Tell me, what motivated you to make this movie, and how did you find all the archival material that you used? Was that difficult?
The film had a strange kind of birth. I was working with an editor, and every time we'd sort of pass each other in the hallway, we'd have another discussion about what it was that we wanted to do. And it all revolved around this idea that there was all this footage about Julia Gillard at the time of her prime ministership that no one had really accessed and put together. And the film A Final Quarter came out and proved to us that it could be done. They'd done the same thing with the story of Adam Goodes, who again for 3 years had this quite incredible career, and through this vein of racism ran through it in the same way a vein of sexism ran through Julia Gillard's time. So both of us were kind of toying with this idea, and then when lockdown happened in 2020, suddenly we had this window to create an archive film. It was the perfect project because we had to shut everything else down. We couldn't do any filming.
Was it challenging actually sourcing the archival footage?
What was challenging was the mass of footage that we had available to us, really. A woman who was in the news every single day for 3 years, and so there was just so much to choose from: audio, news, social media, that in some ways we were paralysed by choice. We were constantly thinking, well, that's great, but I wonder what else happened that day, and we go searching for more. So it wasn't hard to actually access the footage, although a lot of it we couldn't license. We had to use fair dealing because a lot of especially commercial media didn't want to license that footage. Mm-hmm. So that aspect of it was difficult, but actually there was also all the parliamentary footage, and that was 3 years worth of question time.
Fantastic, very rich material. And Deanne, how do you make the decision to get involved with a project, and why did you choose this project to get involved with?
Well, Tosca and Karina Holden, her producer, they're a fantastic team. They do great work, and we premiered The Final Quarter at the Sydney Film Festival, and it was such an incredible night, that night in the cinema, to see people respond to that film and really have our own reactions as a society put right up in our face. And so when I understood that Tosca and the team were taking the same approach with the same editor, actually, who had worked on Final Quarter, but focusing in on Julia's time as Prime Minister, I was, I think, in the context of the post-Me Too world that we're living in, this ongoing thread that we are seeing of the way that we as Australians treat women in power, which, frankly, I find very disturbing, that there is quite an undercurrent that we treat women in power very differently to how we treat men. And I thought that this film could be a great way for us to reflect on that. And so when Tosca sent me a link to the film, and I watched it here at home, and I have to tell you, I was sobbing with rage by the end of the film, literally sobbing with rage, and sad, because what you see and what's so interesting is to reflect on this 10 years on. And it is an incredibly powerful film that I hope everybody watches, and I hope we use it to reflect and have a conversation around how we actually think about women in power in the Australian context. And I think actually leading up to a federal election next year, it's incredibly timely. And so I want to help get that story out there, and I want to help create conversations around it.
Brilliant. And you make the point about women in power being treated differently to men in power, and you're involved in an industry which has been dominated by men for a very long time. So have you had personal experience with that?
Look, I've personally, I haven't faced those sorts of issues, but I've seen plenty of my sisters in arms who have been, not given the same opportunities as men. The whole story that, that Carol, a lot of your work focuses on, where, you talk about men being judged on their potential and women being judged on their track record. And that has happened throughout the screen industry. And, when we created the Gender Matters program back in 2015, that was because we were tracking through the statistics, and what you could see in terms of female participation in the screen industry in Australia, we literally had not been making headway in statistically very much since the 70s. Yeah. The numbers was in terms of looking at number of female directors, number of female producers, number of female writers as kind of three core metrics. We had sort of more women who were successful in the producing stakes, but the creative, and that was like, oh, well, because women are good organisers, but the core creative roles were not anywhere near as equal as it should be. And, it's not just a matter of equity for people who want to practice in the screen industry. Screen content is the most pervasive cultural influence of our time. And if we aren't telling stories about women, and if we are not looking at the world also through a female lens as well as, a male lens, then we're actually undermining ourselves as a society. And I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, watching Australian television, watching films, and my DNA is infused with unconscious bias about what I think leaders are. When you say to me a leader, I can't help it. I will picture a man, because that's what all of the cultural product that I've been consuming for 50 plus years has told me. And so it's absolutely critical that we make sure that we're showing, presenting, telling stories, bringing the perspective of all of our society. And if women are making up 51% of the population, we're a pretty core part of that. And so it's critical that our stories are told, and that they're told by a diversity of people. And so that's why I'm passionate about it, not because of a particular bad experience I had across the industry, but because this is actually so important to us. Yeah. And I think it ties into, Carol, I absolutely think it ties into how we treat women in power, because it's something is unconsciously is telling us that women shouldn't be there.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. You expressed that so beautifully. Thank you. And Tosca, how have you as a creative in the industry found support for your projects? Do you find that men, your male colleagues, are supportive of your work? And have you found that being able to raise the funding for your projects, has that been challenging at all?
Always challenging, but it is changing. In the last few years, I mean, the Northern Pictures, who I work with now, is almost all women. And in the same way that it happens in politics and every industry, good women bring good women with them. So I can see that happening everywhere now, but it didn't used to be the case. And I've certainly been sacked from jobs because I'm not playing the game that I'm meant to be playing. And that's...
Sorry, what's that game? What's the game you're meant to be
playing?
Well,
I've been sacked from a job when there was a female presenter and I didn't like the way that she was being treated and predated on. And because I spoke up, I was a problem and I was sacked. And I think every woman in my industry would have a similar story to that, and a worse story too. I think there's so many men who've been running the game for so long on their terms that has been the culture. But certainly, and I realise that I am in this beautiful bubble now of a really female-centred company, but I can see it changing even at conferences where women are really prominent and the work that they're doing is speaking for itself, and they're offering something that people are really responding to, and often it's fresh and it's stories that haven't been told. And I think even just in the last couple of years that you can really see that happening, and I think it's very exciting. As a member of the industry, it's really exciting.
Yeah, and of course the industry that you talk about in the US has been sort of totally upended through, the Me Too movement. That doesn't seem to have happened in Australia to the same extent, and yet I'm sure we're not that different. So why do you think that is, Tosca?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of stories to be told. I think there's a lot of men who are pretty nervous at the moment. I think maybe in Australia the Me Too movement has been impacted by the size of our industry. It is so small comparative to the States that if people blow the whistle, there's nowhere else for them to turn. They're very nervous about their place in the industry and about where funding is coming from. And I think everyone feels like they're walking such a narrow line that they just cannot afford to trip off either way. And, of course, you're taking a risk by calling men out. You just have to look at how long it took to call out, what's his name, the gardening...
Don Burke, yes.
Well, that had been going on for years. Yeah. And when it finally blew, so many women spoke out. And you think, I thought it was just this cascade suddenly of stories that they had held on to for such a long time, and so many of them. And you can't tell me that not one of them wanted to speak out. They just didn't feel they could. So I think, we've still got a way to go.
Yeah, I think, Carol, that the defamation laws in Australia compared to the defamation laws in the US is absolutely one of the reasons that you haven't seen that the same sort of reckoning happening. But I do also think that, particularly the funding sources and the way in which projects get up in Australia is quite different because of the studio system in the US that we don't really have here. And so Screen Australia does play a very significant role, as does, for example, the ABC. So, and, to Screen Australia's credit, it's absolutely trying to drive some structural reform. And the new set of Screen Australia KPIs that sort of came out last year were all about trying to make sure that by the end of 21-22, over a 3-year average, that at least 50% of the projects that Screen Australia was supporting through development or production funding, that they would have at least 50% of females in key creative roles. And it's hard to track that on a year basis, because projects, come in and out at different times, but across the 3-year average, we are actually seeing significant progress. We're not there yet, but we're seeing real progress. And certainly in those producer, director, writer roles, there's sort of a lot of change happening there. And then the ABC as a commissioner and SBS as a commissioner have been very specific in also ensuring diversity. We've still got a lot of work to do in some of the other roles, the more behind the scenes roles, cinematography and music, all of those sort of other core and crew roles. There's still a lot of work to do there. And if you talk, and Tosca will have a view on this, but a lot of the creatives I talk to tell me it is a very different experience working on a set that has, say, 50% women on it versus a set that's very male dominated. And so I think actually by that sort of encouragement from the agencies and the commissioners and just a lot of the production companies that we have, where there's more and more women coming into the fold, they're kind of creating that environment, and so we're seeing that change. We've still got a way to go on trying to find flexible childcare for working on sets and those sorts of things, but there's work being done, and I think that's driving some of the change.
Fantastic. Tosca, do you have a view on what working on a set is like when there are equal numbers or close to equal numbers of men and women?
It has massively changed in that, especially I've worked on a few drama sets, which is obviously a much bigger team, and it has been so male dominated for such a long time. I think it's better for the men too. I think men are enjoying it more. It's become a less there's less competition. It's more inclusive. It really is so benefiting everybody, and creatively as well.
Fantastic. Well, getting back to strong female lead, was there anything that you came across, Tosca, in the footage that you really wanted to use but thought I'd better not use that?
That is such a good question. It wasn't so much that there was that we couldn't use it, because we could use a fair dealing defence, which means that footage that even if, as some of the commercial stations said, no, we won't license this to you, even if we were told that, we were able to use it under the fair dealing legislation, which is basically if you are telling a story that is, and Deanne might be able to correct me on the actual correct definition of this, but the way I read it is that this footage is supporting your argument, and that argument is a fair argument, then you can use it under fair dealing legislation, even if it is not licensed footage. So that was true, for example, of everything of Alan Jones. So in previous projects like The Final Quarter, Alan Jones's voice has been changed because there's been absolutely no way of licensing anything that's been shot through his radio station. So there was much more of that we could have used, and there was a lot of footage that when we first started was so infuriatingly awful that I can't believe by the end we didn't have it in there. It was hard to put in a moment that we couldn't contextualise within a larger story. So there was certainly no shortage of sexist material for us to draw on. So when we first started this project, the commissioning editors said, but do you think you'll have enough to support a feature documentary? And I said, look, I'm pretty confident that will be the case. Well, I can tell you I could have made this 3 times as long. There's no shortage. And that's just what was caught on camera.
Did that shock you?
Look, it's so much isolated stuff shocked me constantly. I was, honestly, my jaw was on the floor, and I expected I thought I knew what I was going to find, but it was much worse, much worse.
Mm. And was Julia involved in the making of this documentary? And if yes, how was she involved and how did that go?
So she's got a really funny relationship with this film because she has always said she didn't want to be the victim. It is so anathema to her personality to be the victim. So it troubled her that we were making this film, even though she wanted it to be made. So her role was everybody who I asked to speak to, she gave them permission to speak to me without any caveats. And that was great. I had some really amazing conversations with people to the point where my husband, who shares this office, said, you should be doing interviews with these people. And I kept saying to him, they're saying these things to me because this is not being recorded. As soon as I started recording this interview, there's no way they'd be telling me these things. But everyone who was there at the time, who was in Parliament, who was on the front bench in both parties, gave me some really amazing insights. So she facilitated all of that. When it actually came to the finished film, one of her advisors used the analogy that I think is a really good one, that imagine the worst breakup you've ever had and somebody makes a film about it. How would you feel about that? Well, that's kind of how it is for Julia, that this film is a really traumatic portrait of her time, none of which she regrets, but we have concentrated the worst parts of that, including the death of her father that she is still obviously dealing with, and the response that the media and even her colleagues had to that. So it's a really difficult film for her, but she's very pleased that it exists.
Yeah, well, I guess as a historical document, and it's very important for Australia to, face up to what our reality was at that time. Deanne, what are your hopes for the film?
Well, I think that point there, Carol, that you just said in terms of us facing up to it is really the key point in a lot of ways, because what's been so fascinating, just even, my own reaction, but then sharing the film with, a number of people, and there's almost like a collective, it's like we're ashamed because we were there. This was only 10 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. And we were all observers to this political theatre playing out and to how Julia was treated by other parliamentarians, by the media, by people across social media. And yet we didn't react in the same way then that watching it now with the lens of 10 years on. And to me, that's the most interesting thing. So I want people to watch this film and to talk about it. I want people to talk about why it is that they think we all sort of sat back and didn't speak up and didn't challenge why it was that we were allowing our first female Prime Minister to be treated in that way. We all know politics is rough and tumble, but there is, as you will see when you watch the film, there is something very different to how we were reacting to Julia across that spectrum of Parliament, media and the general public. And when you actually reflect on her, and it doesn't matter what side of politics you sit on, here she was in a minority government actually achieving a significant amount of change, yet everything, all of the conversation was about her jackets, about her hairstyle, about, her marital status or lack thereof, and all of these things that were so, a male would never have been treated in the way that she was treated. So I think it's really important for us to sort of talk about that. And then everything, having that conversation in the context of the conversations we've had this year, the Women's March, the revelations of what's happening inside Parliament, an institution that is there to help us be a better society, to govern us, to guide us, to lead us, for us to participate in democracy, yet we are treating women, 51% of the population, in the way that we still are. And, all of the incredible work you do, Carol, to try and support more women to get into politics and to be part of the political environment. I'm hopeful that this film, when people see it at the end, it won't put them off doing that. It will actually make them all the more inspired to engage in the political process, because, democracy ignored is democracy lost. And if we're not having full participation in our democracy from all of our community and all of our society, then it's not true democracy. And by treating women in the way that we're treating them, we're not being the best democracy that we can be. So I hope it's going to see women signing up to get into, to stand, to run for power, and to be part of that conversation, and to say we're just not going to put up with this sort of rubbish anymore.
You'll be pleased to hear that, notwithstanding the last 18 months in politics, that we had the greatest number of fabulous women applying for the Pathways to Politics course, because I think you're absolutely right. I think women are saying now, we actually need a seat at the table to be able to change this. We're not going to put up with this anymore. You bring up a really interesting issue about what we were prepared to put up with during Julia's prime ministership. And I remember being completely outraged when Germaine Greer commented on Julia's, physicality on a Q&A panel or something. I could not believe that. And I thought, this is really... And she actually got a lot of flack for that, Germaine Greer. So there was a contingent of the media, and probably it was mainly female journalists, who were outraged and did express the outrage that our Prime Minister at that time, Julia Gillard, had to deal with. And I guess, in a way, we were overwhelmed by opposition voices and a more right-wing media that really heaped such disdain upon her in a way that would, as you say, would have been totally, totally unacceptable if she had been a male Prime Minister.
When you see that Alan Jones interview in particular, I was screaming at the television that I was watching, going, how dare you speak to a Prime Minister like that? It was irrelevant whether she was female, male, our elected leader, where's the respect? And there was no respect because she was a woman. And it breaks my heart. And then, we look at what's happening in Afghanistan today, and, and people will say, oh, don't be dramatic, Deanne, for heaven's sake. But this is a continuum of behaviour and attitudes. And we still have work to do to actually acknowledge and accept the humanity of women, and to not see them as lesser. And this is sort of part of the issue that we have, that our psyche is, when we think of a normal person, our DNA, our implicit, the implicit sort of unconscious bias that we're carrying is because we've been told that a normal person is a man, and the women, we have to fit in around that. That is unacceptable in 2021. I mean, that is just completely unacceptable. And I do believe the screen industry has a big role to play in that, because of the questions of the stories we tell and how we represent them. But if we're not respecting our female leaders in that way, then you sort of think, well, what hope is there for the rest of society? So I think this is a really important conversation. And I think that we have had enough. And I think I think Annabelle Crabb's fabulous documentary series, Misrepresented, is such a great companion piece to this story, because she was interviewing people and eliciting, reactions and perspective. The archival approach that Tosca and the team have taken to this film, there's nowhere to hide. This is what we said. This is what we did. There's no reinterpretation. This is what we did and how we treated someone. And I think there's a lot to reflect upon by watching the film and thinking about our reactions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. There seems to be a real groundswell about this. There's an ABC series on at the moment, a short one on the 7:30 report of why women are angry. And I know that the 7 a.m. podcast has a podcast starting on I think it's September the 1st, around the Me Too movement in Australia. So yeah, there is a groundswell. So let's make sure that we keep the voices loud and proud. But Tosca, do you think that men are going to have the same visceral reaction to the film that women do? Because I, like Deanne, I mean, I had a lump in my throat, and I wasn't sure whether it was rage or whether it was, sadness. It just kept changing from rage to sadness throughout watching the film. It was very, very powerful. But do you think men are going to have the same reaction as women do?
No. I think some men will, but certainly so far, the reaction from women has been incredible. And you two are sort of testament to that so many women have reacted like you have. And it's true that some men, especially men who are close to the stories, who were there in one way or another. But I think this is an issue that women react to because we all have a stake in it, and we've all experienced it one way or another. There's plenty that all of us can relate to in this film. The fact that she's Prime Minister is just indicative of the fact that it trickles all the way down. So if it's happening to her, it's happening to the woman on the shop floor, and it's so rife through our community. And I think too often young women will say, "But the feminist cause has been won; it's done." And I think part of my need to make this film was to say, you need to look at this. We all need to understand. And this was something that Anne Summers said when she did an amazing speech that was quite influential for me in making this film about women's rights at work. And it was all based on Julia Gillard in 2012. She really called it at the time. And she said, we have to expose what is being said, no matter how awful it is, to understand it. There's always an argument that, why do we keep talking about what Alan Jones is saying? Why do we keep giving him oxygen? Well, because a lot of people are listening to him. He's got a lot of influence. And so I think we really need to be, calling it all out and making it clear what is being said.
Well, you'll be very happy to hear that Alan Jones is never listened to in Victoria.
And there's Andrew Bolt. There's a lot of men in those pretty influential positions within media. And then, the Murdoch media obviously has a huge role to play in all of this. And Julia Gillard has certainly said that if there was one element she could have really dealt with during her leadership, that's what it would be. It wasn't the Liberal Party. It wasn't within her own party. It was the Murdoch media.
Right. Well, I think she'd be joined by Kevin Rudd, Malcolm Turnbull. I think there are, leaders, ex-leaders of this country, all of whom have felt that the Murdoch media exercises way too much power in this country. And actually, that's quite an interesting conversation to have, isn't it? Because there seems to be heated agreement about the fact that there is too much power vested in one media source in this country. I mean, Deanne, you have a legal background. I mean, is there anything that can be done about that?
Well, the question of media diversity is the whole media industry is obviously going through massive transition with the influence of the the platforms such as Facebook and Google, etc., and how that impacts the pre-existing business models in the media industry, which has tended to lead to some concentration, that concentration where we've seen shutdown of a lot of local newspapers and changing ways that people source the media that they watch, but they tend to be watching some narrowed actual source material. And our competition laws have essentially facilitated that happening. Now, obviously, there's a lot of conversation about the need for an inquiry into that level of media concentration. And it will be interesting to see what comes of that. There's a lot of interesting movement across the media industry to try and find new ways of conversation. Fascinating new platform called, PS Media that's looking at setting up, that's looking at creating some diverse local voices. So I think it will be, the next couple of years are going to be interesting to see how that plays out, whether or not Mr Rudd's attempt to get a royal commission into the Murdoch media gets up. That'll be interesting to watch. But I think, we've become very tribal in our media consumption and then tribal in our conversations, and that is not, we're seeing the impact of that across the globe, not just here in Australia. And that's the vaccine hesitancy, all of these sort of issues that have happened across the US and here. We really need to have conversations about that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how we're all starting to see the echo chambers that we all are living within. It's fascinating. It will be interesting to see how that evolves. Tosca, I can't finish this interview without asking you, are you watching anything on any of the streaming channels at the moment? And
Yes.
What would you recommend?
Yes, I've just finished watching the first season, and I'm a bit behind the times here, of Modern Love, which is on Prime, and it's fantastic. I didn't like the second series as much, but I did really enjoy it. I think Hacks is great.
Oh, fabulous.
Hysterical.
Fabulous.
Yeah, they're my two favourites this week.
Okay, have you watched White Lotus?
No, I should.
Definitely. Very quirky, very quirky.
Okay, great.
Yes, and Deanne, how about you? What are your recommendations?
Well, I'm going to give some recommendations for films to watch in the next little while, Carol, because there are some fabulous Australian films coming out. Here Out West, that just premiered at Cinefest Oz over in Perth, and The Drover's Wife, Leah Purcell, incredible Australian talent, writer, director, actor. So her take on The Drover's Wife is, I'm very, very excited to see that. There is a beautiful indie Australian film on Stan at the moment called My First Summer, which everyone should have a look at. It's really, really lovely. Then there's a new documentary coming out called Big Deal, which is about power and money in Australian politics, which is also a must-watch. Under the Volcano, a doco directed by Gracie Otto, which is actually about the island of Montserrat and the music studio that was sort of on there. And then, of course, Strong Female Lead, which will be premiering on SBS on September the 12th, Tosca.
Correct.
So watch that. And another great Australian film is coming out next year, will be Falling for Figaro, directed by Ben Lewin and produced by Judy Levine, starring Danielle MacDonald, about opera set in Scotland. It is so much fun, really, really worth a look.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it's great to hear how vibrant the Australian film industry is.
We have some really exciting films that will be coming out at the end of this year, of course, as soon as cinemas open up again, end of this year and into next year. There's a lot of really great stories to come.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you both, and thank you so much for your courage, your forthrightness, and your passion. It's just fabulous. And I'm sure the Australian screen industry is just going to go from strength to strength with women like you at the helm. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you, Carol. Really lovely to be part of the conversation.